Air defense, do your job, fuck.
Emuloskia.
Another one. Wow, and I got 59.
Where? Bazooka!
Looks like another one! Another one!
Another one!
There, another one!
There it goes! There!
On the Belarusian front, something is clearly being prepared. The Russian dictator Vladimir Putin urgently summoned his Belarusian counterpart, Alexander Lukashenko. And it is known that the two of them held closed-door talks for many hours late at night at the residence in Valdai. The Kremlin immediately stated that there would be no press conferences or joint statements following this meeting. But all indirect signs indicate that these two dictators are up to something. The plane of the Belarusian dictator, Alexander Lukashenko, was acting like it was part of some special operation. After taking off from Minsk, he turned off the transponder over the Tver region. And the traffic on the M11 highway near Vladimir Putin's residence was blocked, and Lukashenko himself was not even shown publicly. So what are Vladimir Putin and Lukashenko talking about behind closed doors for so many hours that they're afraid to even leave the transponder on? What's so secret there? To understand this, I think we need to put together three storylines from the past few days. They seem separate, but it's actually one big story. The first storyline is that the Kremlin is dragging Belarus into the war, and Lukashenko has admitted this. The second is that Lukashenko is resisting and tells Gryzlov to his face that he won't go along with it. And the third is that Russia is suffocating without fuel after attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces. Also in Russia, military factories are increasingly catching fire. Factories. And besides the supply of gasoline from Belarus, there are all the signs of moving military production in order to hide it in Belarus. Ukrainian soldiers used Ukrainian Flamingo missiles on the night of June 27 to strike the Titan Barricades military-industrial complex plant in Volgograd. At this plant, Russia produces artillery systems and special military equipment, in particular components of missile launchers used for strikes against Ukrainian civilians. Well, meanwhile, reports from Crimea have recorded not just Russian tourists fleeing, but also Russian soldiers. Well, Vladimir Putin's approval rating has dropped to its lowest point since the start of the full-scale war, and this is on the eve of the Duma elections in September. And against this backdrop, Lukashenko, before flying to Russia, told Belarusians that he would be gone. For a very long time, while Ukrainian intelligence is recording preparations for an invasion from the territory of Belarus. In general, let's unravel this tangle of events together. My name is Alexei Pechi, it's June 27th. Let's figure out all these events together. But before we start, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and leave any comment under this video. This will be very important for promoting this episode on YouTube, and I will be grateful to you for that. I'll start with the latest news. Overnight into Saturday, June 27th, the Russian city of Volgograd was subjected to a missile attack, as a result of which the Titan Barricades defense plant, which produces launchers for Iskander-M and Topol-M missile systems, was damaged. It is reported that 5 Ukrainian Flamingo missiles were launched at Volgograd. The founder of the company that produces Flamingo missiles, Denis Stilberg, published not only a video recording of the launch of these missiles, but also footage showing explosions in Volgograd as a result of these missiles hitting the city. Local residents reported a series of explosions at around 4 a.m. local time, and later videos appeared online, one of which shows a missile striking an industrial facility. And on the eve of the attack, the Russian National Guard, Rosaviatsia, announced the temporary closure of Volgograd airport. Another one. Well, editor.
Here, it's done. Let's take it.
Shurova needs to. 9 Shurova, these ones here. Hold on, Shurova, 159. Get out!
Don't go, damn it! Don't go, damn it! Hold on, damn it! Stay, damn it! Stay, damn it! Stay, Shurova! Help! Help!
Another one, Shurova! Another one!
Yeah, where?
Go, go!
Shturov. Where? There he is, flying.
Mom, we're not going to the sticks!
We're not going to the sticks. We're living here for now. Shturova for 3 hours. Shturova for an hour. Shturova. It's being confirmed
that a strike was carried out on the Titan plant.
According to data from the main directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, the enterprise is part of Roscosmos and produces self-propelled launchers for Iskander-M operational tactical missile systems, autonomous launchers for the Topol-M complex, artillery parts for Mesta-S self-propelled howitzers, and other specialized military equipment. It is important to note that even locals have already confirmed, quote, an attack by Ukrainian high-speed aerial targets, which indicates that these were not drones but specifically Flamingo missiles. In addition, the Security Service of Ukraine carried out a second strike this month on an oil pumping station. The second one was in the Vladimir region, which is a key link in the fuel supply system for the Moscow region and for export deliveries. The Security Service of Ukraine clarified that the attack was carried out as part of a 40-day operation approved by Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, aimed at putting pressure on Russia to force it to end the war. The previous attack on this same facility was recorded on June 10, and before that, on May 24, this location was also targeted. So this Vitorogo is part of the transportation structure. It is part of Transneft Verkhnaya Volga and serves as a key logistics hub for pumping light petroleum products. Diesel fuel is transported through it to the Moscow Ring petroleum product pipeline, and from there to major oil depots around Moscow. In addition, the station supplies petroleum products for export through the ports of the Baltic Sea. Well, it doesn't anymore. Overall, the strikes on oil infrastructure continue to worsen the fuel crisis in Russia. As of now, restrictions on fuel sales are officially in place in 32 regions of the country, as well as in annexed Crimea and the occupied territories of Ukraine. That's what has been officially announced. But there are regions where all this is done unofficially, by individual gas stations. But we'll talk about that a little later, as well as about the situation in Crimea, which caused a record drop in Vladimir Putin's ratings right before the State Duma elections in September. The fact is that against the backdrop of intensified Ukrainian attacks on Russia, Vladimir Putin urgently summoned Alexander Lukashenko. And this is also happening amid increasingly specific statements that Russia wants to drag Belarus into the war against Ukraine again. Yesterday evening, in fact late in the evening on June 26, Alexander Lukashenko flew to Vladimir Putin. And the very atmosphere of this meeting spoke louder than any statements. Vladimir Putin received him at his residence in Valdai, a place where you can talk without prying eyes and ears. The Belarusian dictator's plane behaved like it was part of some special operation. He took off from Minsk at 9:46 Moscow time and turned off the transponder over the Tver region. And the M11 highway near Putin's residence was temporarily open to traffic. The meeting was announced after the fact. Minsk and the Kremlin only revealed it after it had already taken place. The negotiations lasted several hours. First one-on-one, then with delegations. And, according to Kremlin spokesperson Peskov, they could even continue today, June 27th. Officially, there were no statements, no press appearances, and no signed documents. Everything was as closed and secret as possible. So what did Vladimir Putin and Lukashenko talk about even under such secrecy? And to understand and analyze this, we need to put together 3 stories from the past few days, or 3 lines of events. Call it whatever you like. They may seem separate, but in reality, it's all one story. And what we're doing here is putting all the pieces together to understand the essence of what's happening. And before we start unraveling this story, I ask you to subscribe to this YouTube channel, like this episode, and be sure to leave any comment under this video. In addition, support the work of this YouTube channel with any donation. You can do this using the links and details in the description of this video. And there is also a link to the Patreon platform where we have a private community and I answer all your questions, where we plan to hold private, separate streams to communicate in a question and answer format, and where we discuss topics for future episodes here on YouTube. So go ahead and join. There are also links to my social networks, and I'll be glad to see you there as well. So, as I already said, we need to analyze 3 lines of events in order to put the whole picture together. So, the first line of events is the Kremlin's attempts to pressure Lukashenko to make him join the war against Ukraine. This is something that is just obvious. On June 23 and 24, the Wall Street Journal, citing current and former Russian and European officials, published what became the real background of the Valdai meeting between Putin and Lukashenko. Russia is pressuring Lukashenko, trying to draw Belarus deeper into the war against Ukraine and possibly open a new front. According to the publication, Moscow's specific demands are as follows: to use Belarusian territory to launch drones against Ukraine, to open a new front in the west in order to divert Ukraine's defense forces from key areas in the east of the country, before Ukraine has time to form new combat brigades to defend the north, as well as to consider Belarus as a staging ground for operations against neighboring NATO countries in order to probe their defenses and undermine Western support for Kiev. And the main lever of pressure here is money, plain and simple. And now, a former Russian intelligence officer, who is privy to the details, told the Wall Street Journal that the Kremlin is threatening to withdraw financial support from Minsk if they refuse. And, which is an important detail, most of these conversations took place between Lukashenko and the Russian ambassador in Minsk, Boris Gryzlov. Remember this name, Boris Gryzlov, because it's key to understanding what exactly Lukashenko said a little later. The second line of events is Lukashenko's public resistance, which suggests that non-public resistance is no longer working, so Lukashenko decided to bring everything out into the open. And this is a very important signal of the Kremlin's desperation. That is, the Kremlin is trying in every possible way to force Lukashenko to openly get involved in the war. Lukashenko doesn't want to do this. The Kremlin continues to increase the pressure, and the only thing Lukashenko can do is to bring all of this out into the open. Lukashenko has publicly taken a position that goes against the Kremlin. On June 25, speaking in front of the same Russian ambassador Boris Gryzlov, he stated, something analysts, by the way, interpreted as a signal to Moscow that Belarus does not want to enter the war in Ukraine. Moreover, he said that he met with representatives of Zelensky in Minsk and gave them a stern warning. But in fact, this warning was addressed to both sides. His words were approximately as follows. Lukashenko told Zelensky's people directly that if he thinks he can talk to Minsk like that and drag it into the war, the nature of the war will instantly change. It will be a completely different war, both in scale and in nature. But Lukashenko immediately added that Gryzlov is really pressuring him to go to war with Ukraine, but that would be a bad idea because Belarusians don't want to fight Ukrainians. This is a double game. By the way, the Institute for the Study of War describes it very well today. On the one hand, there's an alleged threat to Kyiv. He says, you can't talk to us like that, or else if we strike, you won't like it. On the other hand, it's a direct refusal to Moscow. Lukashenko continues to buy time and avoids the Kremlin's increased attempts to drag Belarus into the war, maintaining relatively neutral rhetoric toward Ukraine. And now, analysts are formulating Lukashenko's dilemma with utmost precision. Lukashenko is trying to balance between maintaining Russian support and what remains of Belarus's degraded sovereignty. And the key marker of this resistance is as follows. Since 2022, Lukashenko has consistently not allowed Belarusian troops to directly participate in Russian operations in Ukraine. And importantly, he almost never adopts Moscow's rhetoric about Ukraine being a threat to Belarus. That is, he says things like, yes, Zelensky, Nazis, Donbass, 8 years, all that, Lukashenko repeated all of this. But Lukashenko has almost never used this rhetoric that supposedly Ukraine is a direct threat to Belarus, and therefore Belarusians need to prepare for something. He tries to avoid this topic if you pay attention. The proof that Lukashenko's resistance was not just words appeared literally in the days before the meeting between Lukashenko and Putin. And on June 19, Zelensky gave Lukashenko an ultimatum to remove the relays on Belarusian territory that help guide Russian strikes. And he gave it until June 26, threatening that otherwise Ukraine would do it itself. That is, physically destroy these relays. What kind of relays are these anyway? They look like harmless TV towers or cell towers, but secretly guide Russian attack drones to targets in Ukraine. They provide communication over distances of up to 150 kilometers and allow the drone's target to be changed right in flight. That is, they help attack Ukrainian targets in real time. They also assist with reconnaissance. And the outcome of this whole story was as follows. On June 24, Zelensky announced that as of June 22, the retransmitters had stopped working in Belarus. That is, Lukashenko silently, without acknowledging the ultimatum allowed by the way, complied with this demand 4 days before the deadline. Now the Institute for the Study of War interprets this clearly. The apparent compliance with the ultimatum shows that Lukashenko is still resisting the Kremlin's efforts to fully drag Belarus into the war. Why is Lukashenko so cautious? It's quite understandable. There are two reasons, and both are existential for him personally. The first is society. Belarusian society demonstrates extremely limited willingness to directly participate in Russia's war against Ukraine. And the political consequences of the 2020 protests still, to some extent, shape the behavior of Lukashenko's regime. He still remembers what happened back then and understands that, to some extent, he was already on the edge. And the second reason is the fear of Ukrainian drones. According to Der Spiegel, Zelensky's ultimatum had a serious impact on Lukashenko. Lukashenko, who reportedly feared Ukrainian drones more than his ally Vladimir Putin last week. Lukashenko himself, in an interview with Al Arabiya on June 15, admitted Belarus's military vulnerability, saying, quote, "Belarus is completely exposed to the Ukrainian armed forces." And after that, he even apologized to Zelensky for his previous offensive words. In other words, Lukashenko started hedging hard, and a bit later I'll explain again why he's doing this. And today, the founder of Firepoint, Dennis Stillerman, stated directly that if Belarus really starts an offensive against Ukraine, Ukrainian drones will literally destroy all of Belarus's critical infrastructure within the very first hours. Moreover, Zelensky has long acknowledged and publicly stated that the defense forces of Ukraine. They have identified about 500 targets on the territory of Belarus that drones will strike within the very first hours. As you can imagine, these are oil refineries, power plants, and so on. And before, this could have been seen as loud bravado, a bluff, and so on. But looking at how Ukrainian drones have been destroying factories in Russia over the past few weeks, destroying oil refineries, they are destroying military factories and even damaging infrastructure in Moscow, which is as heavily protected by air defenses as possible. Lukashenko understands that this is no longer a bluff, it's not an empty threat. And if Ukraine is given a reason to attack, it will attack. And in fact, literally the first military provocation from the territory of Belarus gives Ukraine every reason. And according to Article 51 of the UN Charter, by the way, it gives the right to self-defense and simply to smash Belarus to pieces. And once again, Lukashenko understands that this is quite real now. He clearly sees what's happening on the territory of Russia. And this is where a third development emerges, which disrupts Vladimir Putin's plans to drag Belarus into the war. Russia is now choking on fuel shortages, and this explains why it needs Belarus. Also, military factories in Russia are burning one after another. And Vladimir Putin understands that very soon he simply won't be able to produce enough weapons. No, he will still be able to produce them, but not in sufficient quantities anymore. This is exactly the underlying factor, if you will, without which the whole picture doesn't come together. While these negotiations between Putin and Lukashenko are taking place, Russia is experiencing the worst fuel crisis in its history. The ones to blame for this crisis are Ukrainian drones. The scale is simply breaking all records. According to Radio Liberty's calculations, as of June 24, these are the latest figures, at least 55 out of 83 regions of Russia reported either rationing the sale of gasoline and diesel at the state level or at the level of individual oil companies. Bloomberg, by the way, gives the same picture, just a little differently, saying that at least two-thirds of Russia's regions have introduced fuel rationing or face shortages after continuous Ukrainian attacks on oil refineries. Two-thirds of Russia's regions. Moreover, since March, more than 24 strikes have hit Russian oil refineries, including 8 out of the 10 largest refineries in Russia. And analysts estimate that more than 20% of all oil refining capacity in Russia has been completely put out of operation. The International Energy Agency has called this level of destruction unprecedented in the entire history of the war. The strike on Moscow in June turned out to be both symbolic and painful at the same time. Last week, Ukraine struck the Gazprom Neft oil refinery in Moscow, which normally supplies up to 40% of the fuel consumed in Moscow. Along with the damage to the giant Taneko plant, this took out about 600,000 barrels per day of refining capacity. 600,000 barrels, that means it's even more than half of all the supply from Moscow. Moreover, the largest gasoline supplier to the Moscow region, the Kapotnya oil refinery, was attacked twice in a month and very importantly was completely put out of operation until the end of this year. It has completely stopped its operations. And here, all three lines of events that we are talking about essentially converge at one point. Why does Russia, with its oil power, hold on to Belarus so tightly? Because Belarus has become Moscow's fuel crutch. For the first time in history, it is Russia that depends on Belarus, not the other way around. And Lukashenko, the cunning old Belarusian dictator, understands and senses this perfectly. Belarus has 2 large oil refineries, and Moscow is increasingly relying on these very refineries to process Russian oil and sell gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel back to Russia. In the first 5 months of 2026, railroad shipments of gasoline from Belarusian oil refineries to Russia increased 13-fold, compared to the same period last year, and diesel shipments tripled. And I emphasize these are the figures before Ukraine destroyed that same plant in Kapotnya, Moscow region. That is, this data is as of the end of May. There is no more recent data yet, but even as of the end of May, just think about it. Gasoline supplies from Belarus to Moscow increased 13 times. So now the situation is even more critical for Moscow. And all this explains why Lukashenko can so boldly refuse Vladimir Putin's attempts to drag Belarus into the war. Putin is pressuring Lukashenko with clear demands. These include launching drones from Belarusian territory against Ukraine, opening a new front in the west, and creating a foothold against NATO. And in addition, Belarusian fuel for the suffocating Russian economy. And all of this is under the threat of Moscow cutting off funding to Minsk. Lukashenko came to the meeting in Valdai with the opposite goal. To keep this Moscow money, that is, to keep the flow of funds, but not to let himself get dragged into a war that would destroy him at home, and would bring Ukrainian drones to Belarusian oil refineries and military facilities. Lukashenko understands this perfectly well. Let me emphasize once again. He is an old, seasoned dictator. He has been in power a long time and knows exactly how everything works. Besides, Lukashenko has only just started rebuilding ties with the West, as strange as that may sound. He is holding meetings with representatives of Donald Trump. And he even says that he's willing to meet with Trump there. And Europe is signaling to him that they're ready to talk to him. If he moves even a little away from Vladimir Putin. And let me remind you, Lukashenko's entire political career is built on maneuvering. Sometimes he's with the West, sometimes with Moscow. Sometimes with the West, sometimes with Moscow. If you look back, rewind time 20 years and take that period, he was constantly rushing back and forth. That's why there was all this secrecy around the meeting between Putin and Lukashenko in Valdai. If there was real unity, alliance, and so on in Valdai, well, they would have shown it on TV. Russian propagandist Solovyov would have been the first to shout about it. The meeting was closed. Lukashenko's plane's transponder was turned off over Russian territory. The lack of public statements, these are all signs of tough bargaining, not some kind of triumph. It's a sign that they're negotiating. And Lukashenko, to use Trump's language, has some aces up his sleeve. And here it's worth remembering another important detail. Lukashenko said that Emmanuel Macron warned him in a phone conversation that France has intelligence indicating that Belarus is planning to increase its involvement in the war. And Macron advised him not to do that, so Lukashenko is under pressure from both sides at once. The Kremlin is pulling him into the war as the West and Kiev warn of consequences. And Valdai, the meeting at Valdai, this is Putin's attempt. Putin's attempt to force his position through and Lukashenko to bargain for the maximum amount of money for the minimum obligations. And against this background, Lukashenko once again proposed a trilateral format of negotiations with himself, Putin, and Zelensky, and he did not rule out a meeting with Trump. Well, of course, on the condition that it is thoroughly prepared and includes a wide range of issues: the embassy, economy, finances, release of convicted persons. That's what he said. This is his personal game. That is, to sell himself to the West as a peacemaker and a kind of communication channel, while at the same time remaining under Moscow's wing. That's what Lukashenko is trying to do right now. But we shouldn't forget that weapons that look very much like Chinese ones have been produced in Belarus for a long time. Moreover, Lukashenko even flew to Beijing separately to meet with Xi Jinping, that is, as a completely separate entity, apart from Moscow. That is, Belarus has its own military-industrial complex, and against the backdrop of strikes by the armed forces of Ukraine on military factories in Russia, Vladimir Putin might ask Lukashenko to hide the production of his weapons in Belarus. This is something that should also be monitored very closely right now. But it is already obvious that Lukashenko once again has the opportunity to maneuver between the West and Moscow. While he is doing this, we can state that the risk of an attack from the territory of Belarus is still decreasing. But it's still worth staying alert. I'm not saying that there is no risk at all. It remains, it exists, but it is decreasing. But Lukashenko is also benefiting from Putin's own weakness. The so-called authorities of temporarily occupied Crimea have declared a state of emergency after several weeks of intense Ukrainian air attacks. And today, the New York Times reports that these strikes have seriously undermined the ability of Putin, the Kremlin dictator, to isolate Russian society from the consequences of the war. Russians are now experiencing the war's consequences themselves. In Kyiv, they have strengthened the growing confidence that it will be possible to force Putin to come to the negotiating table, even though Russia continues to shell Ukraine with missiles and drones. As a result, instead of being a valuable asset, Crimea has become a burden for Moscow. And now, analysts are noting that because of Ukraine's attacks, Russian tourists and residents of the occupied peninsula are leaving occupied Crimea in large numbers, as well as Russian Federation military personnel, security service employees, and representatives of the occupation authorities. Analysts from the Institute for the Study of War note that the outflow of this population from occupied Crimea may lead to short-term demographic consequences, which could intensify in the future, in the long term if the Ukrainian strike campaign continues. The seriousness of the situation is also indicated by the fact that on June 26, Russian dictator Vladimir Putin signed a decree extending the current ban on the export of oil and petroleum products by Russian oil companies until December 31, 2027. Think about it, Putin again. I mean, this decree means that Russian oil companies should not comply with the oil and petroleum product price caps set by the G7 countries. But along with that, they also added that in general, gasoline, kerosene, diesel, and so on cannot be exported anywhere until the end of next year, because there are huge problems in the domestic market. That's why now we'll be watching the actions of Lukashenko himself, who, as we can see, has been isolated. He's not seen anywhere in public, he's not making any appearances. Well, both Putin and Lukashenko are still holding their meeting behind closed doors, not publicly, turning off transponders and so on. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments under this episode, subscribe to this YouTube channel, and hit the like button. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so financially with any, even the smallest donation using the links and details in the description of this video. There is also a link to the Patreon platform where we have a private community. There we discuss topics that aren't covered here on YouTube, where I answer your personal questions and go over various topics and situations. And there we also plan to have private streams with a limited number of viewers where we will communicate in a question and answer format. I'll leave it at that once again. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.